Hi, I'm Natalie Brennan. 3 months ago, I sat across from my father at his favorite steakhouse in Medina while he told me I was an embarrassment to the family name. My mother nodded along, swirling her wine like she was watching a moderately entertaining play. My brother Brandon actually laughed out loud when I mentioned I might be leaving my job. He said, and I quote, "Finally giving up on pretending you belong in the big leagues?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That dinner happened on a Tuesday. By Friday, I'd let them all believe I'd been fired from Vertex Systems, the cloud infrastructure company I'd helped build from a 50-person startup into an $8.2 billion industry leader. I posted nothing on LinkedIn. I stopped talking about work at family gatherings. I let my mother tell her country club friends that I was taking time to figure things out. But here's what they didn't know. While they were planning an intervention to help their poor, unemployed Natalie, I was in a conference room on the 42nd floor of our downtown Seattle headquarters, sitting across from 7 board members and our CEO, negotiating the terms of my exit package. The number we eventually agreed on? $47 million. Not because I was failing. Because I knew exactly where all the bodies were buried, and they knew I could make their carefully constructed empire collapse with 3 phone calls and a well-timed press release. Let me take you back to where this really started. Not the dinner. Not even the moment I realized my family had been undermining me for years. It started 4 months earlier, on a morning that felt like any other Wednesday in Seattle. Rain tapping against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, the sound of keyboard clicks and hushed conference calls creating that familiar tech company symphony. I was reviewing Q3 projections when my assistant knocked on my door frame. She looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for someone who'd worked with me for 5 years and had seen me handle everything from product launches to investor meltdowns. "Stephen Lockhart wants to see you in his office. Now." Stephen was our CEO. A man I'd known since the early days when Vertex was just 12 people working out of a converted warehouse in Sodo. We'd pulled all-nighters together. I'd been there when he pitched our Series B to investors who thought cloud infrastructure was already too crowded. He'd been at my promotion celebration when I made Chief Technology Officer at 31, the youngest C-suite executive in company history. We weren't exactly friends, but we had history. The kind of history that makes you think you're safe. His office was on the opposite end of the building, past the open floor plan where our engineers worked, past the glass-walled conference rooms with names like Nimbus and Cirrus, past the break room that still had the espresso machine I'd personally campaigned for in year 2. I noticed people weren't making eye contact as I walked by. A few conversations stopped mid-sentence. The air felt different, charged with something I couldn't quite name yet. Stephen's door was open but he wasn't alone. Patricia Dunn from HR sat in one of his leather chairs, her tablet on her lap, her expression carefully neutral. That's when I knew. You don't bring HR to a friendly chat. "Natalie," Stephen said, gesturing to the empty chair. "Thanks for coming up." I sat down slowly, keeping my face calm even though my mind was already racing through possibilities. Patricia offered me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Stephen leaned back in his chair, doing that thing he always did when he was about to deliver bad news, pressing his fingertips together like he was praying. "We've been doing some restructuring," he started, and I almost laughed. Restructuring. That beautiful corporate word that meant absolutely nothing and everything at the same time. "The board has some concerns about the technology division's direction. We think it might be time for some fresh perspectives at the leadership level." Fresh perspectives. Another phrase that landed like a brick wrapped in tissue paper. I looked at Patricia, who was studying her tablet like it contained the secrets of the universe. Then back at Stephen, who couldn't quite hold my gaze. "You're removing me from CTO." It wasn't a question. Stephen shifted in his chair, and for just a second, I saw something in his expression. Not quite guilt. Maybe discomfort. Or possibly calculation. "We're exploring options. We wanted to have this conversation before any decisions were finalized. Get your perspective on how you'd like to proceed." That's when I understood. This wasn't about my performance. My division had exceeded every target for the past 18 months. We'd just launched our AI integration platform 2 months ahead of schedule. Our customer retention was at 93%, the highest in company history. This was about something else entirely. I took a slow breath, buying myself time to think. My first instinct was to fight, to demand explanations, to point out every metric that proved I was exactly the right person for this role. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way Patricia kept glancing at the door like she was expecting security. Maybe it was how Stephen's jaw was set, that stubborn look he got when he'd already made up his mind. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe I was just tired of fighting to prove myself to people who'd already decided I didn't belong. "I'd like some time to consider my options," I said carefully. "How long do I have?" "Take the rest of the week. We can meet again Monday." I stood up, surprised my legs were steady. Patricia finally looked at me, and I caught something in her expression. Was it sympathy? Or was she just relieved I wasn't making a scene? Walking back to my office felt like moving through water. Everything looked the same but felt completely different. My nameplate was still on the door. My diplomas were still on the wall: Stanford Computer Science, MIT Graduate Work in Distributed Systems. The photo of me and my team at our last hackathon still sat on my desk, all of us grinning like we'd just discovered fire. But I could feel it already, that subtle shift in the air when someone's on their way out. I closed my door and sat down at my desk, staring at the Seattle skyline without really seeing it. The Space Needle looked small from up here, almost fragile against the gray clouds rolling in from the sound. My phone buzzed. A text from my brother Brandon. "Sunday dinner at Dad's. Mom says it's mandatory. Don't embarrass us by being late." I stared at that message for a long moment. Don't embarrass us. That had been the background music of my entire life. Don't embarrass us by studying computer science instead of law. Don't embarrass us by working at a startup instead of a prestigious firm. Don't embarrass us by being too ambitious, too outspoken, too visible. My father had built his career as a corporate executive at traditional companies, the kind with mahogany boardrooms and golf course deals. He'd never understood tech, never understood why I'd chosen this path. My mother cared more about what her friends thought than what I actually did. And Brandon, my older brother by 3 years, had followed Dad's blueprint perfectly. Investment banking, the right clubs, the right wife, the right image. I'd always been the odd one out. The daughter who chose innovation over tradition, who wore jeans to work instead of suits, who talked about artificial intelligence and cloud architecture while they discussed stock portfolios and vacation homes. They tolerated my success because it was harder to criticize someone pulling a 7-figure salary, but they never really respected it. To them, I was still just Natalie, the girl who never quite fit the mold they'd cast for me. I didn't respond to Brandon's text. Instead, I opened my laptop and started going through my files. Every project I'd led. Every innovation I'd championed. Every piece of intellectual property I'd developed. I'd been at Vertex for 9 years. I'd written significant portions of our core infrastructure code. I held patents on 3 of our key technologies. I knew every partnership deal, every client relationship, every skeleton in every closet. And then I started thinking about what Stephen hadn't said in that meeting. He hadn't mentioned a severance package. He hadn't talked about transition timelines. He'd used words like exploring and options, corporate speak for we haven't figured out how to get rid of you yet without it costing us too much. That's when the idea first formed. It was small at first, just a whisper in the back of my mind. But the more I thought about it, the more it grew. They wanted me gone. Fine. But they were going to pay for it. And not just with money. They were going to pay with the one thing that mattered to them more than anything else. Their reputation. Their carefully crafted image as the hottest cloud company in the Pacific Northwest. Their pristine story of innovation and leadership. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. Carolyn Wade. We'd met in law school, back when I thought maybe I'd follow my father's path after all, before I realized that corporate law would slowly kill everything interesting about me. Carolyn had been the smartest person in our contracts class, sharp as broken glass and twice as dangerous when she needed to be. We'd studied together, pulled all-nighters before exams, and I'd helped her through a particularly brutal family crisis during our second year. She'd told me once that she owed me, that if I ever needed anything at all, I should call. I'd never taken her up on that offer. Until now. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, crisp and professional with an undercurrent of warmth reserved for people she actually liked. Natalie Brennan. It's been what, 4 years? 5, I said. Since that tech conference in San Francisco. Right. You were keynoting. I was sitting in the back trying not to fall asleep during the blockchain panel. What can I do for you? I need a lawyer. Corporate law, specifically employment and executive compensation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Someone who knows how to negotiate with boards and make CEOs very, very nervous. There was a pause, and I could almost hear her smile. Well, that's my favorite kind of work. What are we talking about here? I'm about to negotiate my exit from Vertex Systems. And I'm going to need someone who can help me make sure they pay me exactly what I'm worth, not what they want to give me. What are you worth? I watched the rain streak down my windows, thinking about 9 years of 60-hour weeks, about the patents with my name on them, about the infrastructure I'd built that was currently generating hundreds of millions in revenue. More than they want to admit. Significantly more. Carolyn laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of steel. Come to my office tomorrow morning. 9 sharp. Bring every contract you've ever signed with them, every email that mentions compensation or equity, and any documentation of promises they've made. We're going to build a case that makes their legal team wake up in cold sweats. After we hung up, I sat there for a while longer, watching the city lights start to flicker on as evening approached. My phone buzzed again. Another text, this time from my mother. Your father has asked me to remind you that dinner starts at 6. Please wear something appropriate. The Ashtons are joining us. The Ashtons. Family friends who'd known us for 20 years, who'd watched Brandon and me grow up, who represented exactly the kind of old money, old values audience my parents loved performing for. Of course they'd be there. Every family dinner was a performance for my parents, a chance to showcase their perfect life, their successful children, their carefully maintained image. I typed back a simple response. I'll be there. But I had no intention of playing my usual role. The dutiful daughter who smiled and nodded while Brandon dominated the conversation. The quiet one who let my father pontificate about business despite never understanding what I actually did. The one who absorbed my mother's subtle criticisms about my appearance, my choices, my entire existence. No, I was going to let them think exactly what they wanted to think. I was going to play into every assumption they'd ever made about me. And while they were busy feeling superior, while they were busy confirming their belief that I'd finally failed, I was going to build something they couldn't even comprehend. I spent the rest of that week preparing. I created copies of everything. Every patent filing with my name on it. Every email discussing my contributions to major deals. Every performance review that praised my leadership. Every piece of code I'd written that was now fundamental to Vertex's core product. I organized it all into folders, cross-referenced and indexed. I was methodical about it, careful. I made sure to do it from my personal laptop, using my personal cloud storage. Nothing that could be traced back to company systems. On Friday afternoon, I met with Carolyn at her office in Pioneer Square. The building was one of those historic Seattle structures, all exposed brick and tall windows, the kind of place that charged premium rent to give tech lawyers some credibility with older clients. Her corner office looked out over the waterfront, and I could see the ferry boats cutting white trails across the gray water. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She'd already reviewed the documents I'd sent over, and she had a legal pad covered in notes, questions, and what looked like a preliminary strategy. Your contract is airtight from their perspective, she said, flipping through pages. Standard non-compete, intellectual property assignments, the usual. But here's where it gets interesting. You filed for 3 patents before your employment contract was updated in 2019. Those patents are technically joint ownership between you and the company, not full assignment. I felt something click into place in my mind. I'd forgotten about that contract update. We'd been growing so fast back then, scaling from startup to real company, and our legal documents hadn't kept pace. So I have leverage. You have a nuclear weapon. Those 3 patents cover fundamental aspects of their current infrastructure. If you decided to dispute ownership or license them to competitors, they'd be looking at years of litigation and potential product disruption. That's not leverage. That's mutually assured destruction. She leaned back in her chair, studying me with sharp eyes. The question is, how far are you willing to go? Because once we start this conversation, there's no going back to business as usual. You're either all in, or you walk away with whatever standard severance they're offering. I thought about my father's voice at dinner, telling me I was an embarrassment. My mother's dismissive laughter. Brandon's smug certainty that I was finally proving I didn't belong. I thought about Stephen Lockhart's careful corporate speak, about Patricia Dunn's sympathetic eyes, about walking past my team and seeing pity in their faces. I'm all in. Carolyn smiled. Not a warm smile. A shark smile. Good. Then here's what we're going to do. Sunday dinner at my father's house was always a production. The Brennan family estate sat on 2 acres of waterfront property in Medina, one of those neighborhoods where every driveway had gates and every gate had a security code. The house itself was a monument to my father's success, all stone and glass and perfectly manicured landscaping that cost more per month than most people's mortgages. Growing up here had felt like living in a museum, a place where everything was valuable and nothing could be touched without permission. I parked my car, a modest Tesla that my mother had once called cute in that tone that meant inadequate, behind Brandon's new Porsche. Of course he'd upgraded again. I sat there for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, preparing myself for what was coming. I'd spent the morning with Carolyn, going through preliminary strategy. We'd outlined a timeline, identified pressure points, discussed exactly how much ammunition I was sitting on. Now I needed to sit through dinner and pretend I was still the Natalie they expected me to be. The one who smiled and nodded. The one who let them believe whatever made them comfortable. My mother opened the door before I could ring the bell. She was wearing cream-colored silk, pearls at her throat, her hair styled in that timeless way that required weekly salon appointments. She looked me up and down with an expression I'd seen 1,000 times, that subtle disappointment she could convey without saying a word. You're late. And is that what you're wearing? I'd chosen dark jeans and a cashmere sweater, perfectly acceptable for a family dinner, but apparently not suitable for whatever image she was trying to project tonight. I didn't apologize. I just walked past her into the foyer where the smell of rosemary and roasted meat was already filling the air. Brandon was in the living room with Vanessa, his wife of 4 years. She was exactly the kind of woman my parents had always hoped I'd become, blonde and polished and completely devoted to maintaining her husband's image. She did charity work that looked good in society pages and threw dinner parties that got mentioned in the right circles. She smiled at me as I walked in, but it was the kind of smile you'd give a distant cousin you barely remembered. Natalie, she said, her voice bright and hollow. So good to see you. How's work? The question landed like a stone. Brandon's eyes flickered with something, amusement maybe, or satisfaction. He knew something. Or at least he thought he did. It's interesting, I said neutrally. Lots of changes happening. I heard Vertex is restructuring, Brandon said, swirling his scotch. He was leaning against the mantel like he was posing for a catalog, all casual confidence. Must be tough with the market being what it is. My mother appeared with a tray of appetizers, those tiny expensive things that were more art than food. She placed them on the coffee table with practiced precision. We ran into Patricia Dunn at the club yesterday, she said, not looking at me. You know, from your company's HR department. Such a lovely woman. She mentioned things were shifting in the technology division. There it was. The confirmation that they'd been talking about me, gathering information, building their narrative. Patricia Dunn at the country club. Of course. This city was smaller than people realized, especially in certain circles. The tech world and the old money world overlapped more than either side wanted to admit. Did she? I said flatly. My father emerged from his study, a tumbler of bourbon in his hand. Gerald Brennan in his natural habitat, master of his domain. He'd retired from his executive position 3 years ago, but he still carried himself like someone who expected deference. He looked at me the way he always did, like he was assessing a quarterly report and finding the numbers disappointing. Natalie. Glad you could make it. The Ashtons arrived 15 minutes later, Robert and Caroline, family friends who'd been fixtures in my parents' social circle for as long as I could remember. They had that particular brand of wealth that came from generations of careful investment and strategic marriages. Caroline kissed my mother on both cheeks like they were European aristocrats. Robert shook my father's hand with the kind of firmness that suggested masculine respect. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, the one with the chandelier that cost more than a year of college tuition and the table that could seat 14 but tonight held only 7. My mother had outdone herself, prime rib and roasted vegetables and some kind of potato dish that probably had a French name. Everything was perfectly plated, perfectly timed, perfectly orchestrated. The conversation flowed around me like I was a rock in a stream. Brandon talked about a deal he'd just closed, something involving derivatives and international markets that he explained with the kind of confidence that suggested he expected applause. My father nodded along, asking pointed questions that showed he understood, that proved they spoke the same language. Vanessa complimented my mother on the meal, on the flowers, on the new artwork in the hallway. Caroline Ashton asked about their upcoming trip to Tuscany. I ate slowly, said little, and watched. This was how it had always been. Brandon at the center, my parents orbiting around his success, everyone else filling in the supporting roles. I'd tried for years to earn my way into these conversations, to prove that what I did mattered too. But tech success didn't translate here. They didn't understand it, didn't value it, didn't want to. So Natalie, Robert Ashton said suddenly, turning his attention to me. Your mother mentioned you're going through some transitions at work. That must be challenging in this economy. The table went quiet. Everyone was looking at me now, waiting. This was the moment they'd been building toward all evening, the chance to address the elephant in the room, to put me in my place with sympathetic concern. Things are definitely changing, I said carefully. But change creates opportunities. My father made a sound, something between a cough and a laugh. Opportunities. Is that what they're calling it now? Brandon leaned back in his chair, that smug expression I'd seen 1,000 times settling onto his face. Come on, Nat. We're family. You can be honest. We heard you're being pushed out. The words hung in the air. My mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Vanessa looked down at her plate, uncomfortable with the directness even if she agreed with the sentiment. Caroline Ashton's eyes went wide with that mixture of shock and delight that people get when witnessing someone else's misfortune. I set down my wine glass slowly, buying myself time. This was it. The moment where I could defend myself, where I could fight back, where I could lay out every achievement and demand they recognize my worth. But I'd learned something over the years. Sometimes the best strategy was to let people believe exactly what they wanted to believe. It's complicated, I said quietly, letting my voice carry just a hint of defeat. There are conversations happening about my role. My mother's expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy if you didn't know her well enough to see the satisfaction underneath. Oh, honey. These things happen. The tech industry is so volatile. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise. You could take some time, figure out what you really want to do. Brandon nodded sagely, like he was some kind of elder statesman instead of my brother who was barely 3 years older. She's right. You've been grinding away at that startup mentality for years. Maybe it's time to consider something more stable. I could make some calls, see if any of the firms I work with need someone with your background. Someone with your background. The condescension was so thick I could have spread it on bread. He was offering to help me find a job, like I was a new graduate who needed career guidance. Like 9 years as CTO of a multi-billion-dollar company meant nothing. That's very generous, I said, keeping my voice level. I'll keep that in mind. My father cleared his throat, that sound he made when he was about to deliver what he considered wisdom. You know, Natalie, there's no shame in acknowledging when something isn't working. I tried to tell you years ago that the tech world was too unpredictable, too unstable for real career growth. Traditional industries, established companies, that's where you build lasting success. He gestured around the table like the evidence of his correctness was self-evident. His house, his wealth, his position in society, all of it built on decades in old-guard corporate America. I could have stayed quiet. Could have let them think whatever they wanted. But something in his tone, that absolute certainty that he'd been right all along, that I'd wasted years proving him wrong only to fail exactly as he'd predicted, made something inside me snap. You're right, I said, and I saw his eyebrows raise slightly. He hadn't expected agreement. About some things being unpredictable. But the tech world taught me something that traditional industries never could. How to value what you bring to the table. How to negotiate from a position of strength. How to know exactly what you're worth and make sure you get paid for it. Brandon laughed. Negotiate? Nat, if you're being forced out, you don't have negotiating power. You take whatever severance they offer and move on. Is that what you do? He blinked at me, confused by the question. It's what anyone would do. You don't have leverage when the company wants you gone. I picked up my wine glass, took a slow sip, and smiled. The kind of smile that didn't reach my eyes. You'd be surprised what constitutes leverage. What's that supposed to mean? My father asked, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. It means I've learned a few things in 9 years. About intellectual property. About patent law. About exactly what happens when someone who helped build your core infrastructure decides maybe they'd like to explore their options. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. My mother set down her fork carefully. Robert Ashton glanced at Caroline with an expression that suggested this dinner had just become far more interesting than expected. Are you threatening your own company? Brandon asked, incredulous. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply acknowledging that I have more options than you might think. That my role wasn't as expendable as they assumed. That removing me comes with complications they're just starting to understand. My father's jaw tightened. That's corporate suicide. You pull something like that, you'll never work in this city again. Maybe. Or maybe I won't need to work again. The silence that followed was absolute. Vanessa had gone very still, like she was trying to become invisible. Caroline Ashton looked like she wanted to pull out her phone and start texting everyone she knew. This was gossip gold, the kind of family drama her circle lived for. My mother recovered first, her voice tight with forced cheerfulness. Well. This conversation has certainly taken an unexpected turn. Perhaps we should move on to dessert. But my father wasn't done. He leaned forward, his expression hard. Listen to me very carefully, Natalie. I don't know what you think you're doing, but threatening your employer, leveraging your position for some kind of payout, that's not how respectable people behave. That's not how this family behaves. This family, I said softly, doesn't know anything about how I behave. You've spent my entire career dismissing what I do, minimizing my achievements, waiting for me to fail so you could feel validated in your certainty that I'd made the wrong choice. Well, congratulations, Dad. You finally get to feel right. I stood up, pulling my napkin from my lap and placing it on the table with deliberate care. Thank you for dinner, Mom. It was lovely. Brandon, I appreciate the job offer but I won't be needing it. I walked toward the door, my heart pounding but my steps steady. Behind me, I heard my mother hiss something at my father, heard Brandon start to speak, but I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I walked out into the cool evening air, got in my car, and drove away from that house with its perfect landscaping and its perfect facade and its perfectly controlled narrative about who I was supposed to be. My hands were shaking by the time I got back to my apartment in Capitol Hill. It was a modest place by Medina standards, just a 2-bedroom condo with a view of the city lights, but it was mine. I'd bought it with my own money, furnished it with furniture I actually liked instead of antiques that required careful maintenance. It felt real in a way my parents' house never had. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my window, looking out at Seattle spread below me. My phone buzzed. 3 texts from my mother. That was completely unacceptable. Your father is furious. We need to talk about this tomorrow. I didn't respond. Instead, I called Carolyn. She picked up on the second ring. I just blew up dinner with my family, I said without preamble. Good, she replied. Did you tell them anything specific? Just enough to make them nervous. Not enough to show my full hand. Perfect. Let them spend the next few days worried. Meanwhile, I've been doing some digging into Vertex's board composition. Did you know that 3 of the 7 board members were vocal opponents of Stephen Lockhart's last acquisition? I did. I'd sat in on enough board meetings to understand the dynamics, the factions, the underlying tensions. One of those board members is Dr. Helen Ortega. She's been at odds with Stephen for months over company direction. She thinks he's too focused on rapid expansion and not enough on technological innovation. Sound like anyone you know? She thinks he's sidelining the technology, I said slowly, understanding where Carolyn was going. By pushing me out, he's proving her point. Exactly. And if we approach this correctly, Helen Ortega might be very interested in understanding exactly why their CTO is being removed. Especially if that removal happens to coincide with some interesting questions about patent ownership and intellectual property rights. I sat down on my couch, my mind racing through possibilities. You want to turn this into a board fight? I want to turn this into a question of company direction and leadership competence. You're not just some executive they can quietly remove. You're the person who built their technology foundation. If they push you out without proper compensation and respect, they're sending a message about how they value innovation. Some board members might find that message very concerning. We spent the next hour going through strategy. Carolyn had already started drafting a letter to the board, not threatening, just inquiring. Asking questions about the process for executive transitions. Mentioning the patent situation in passing, like it was just an administrative detail that needed clarification. Making it clear that I wasn't going quietly, but not making explicit threats that could be used against me. Send it Tuesday, I said. Give them the weekend to stew. Let Stephen spend Monday worrying about what I'm going to do. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and started going through files again. Not company files this time, but personal ones. Every email I'd saved over the years, every conversation about my contributions, every moment where someone had acknowledged my value. I was building a narrative, a story about who I was and what I'd done. Not for them, but for me. Because I realized that for years I'd let other people define my worth. My family, with their dismissive condescension. My company, with their careful corporate language. Even myself, with my constant need to prove I belonged. But I did belong. I'd earned my place. And if they wanted me gone, they were going to pay for it. Not just in money, though that mattered. In recognition. In acknowledgement of exactly what I'd built and what it was worth. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Brandon. What the hell are you doing? Dad is losing it. You need to apologize. I stared at that message for a long time. The old Natalie would have felt guilty, would have worried about causing family discord, would have considered smoothing things over. But that version of me had sat through too many dinners being ignored, too many conversations being dismissed, too many years being treated like the problem child who needed guidance. I'm doing exactly what I should have done years ago, I typed back. Standing up for myself. His response came immediately. You're being selfish and stupid. This isn't going to end well for you. I turned off my phone and set it face down on the coffee table. Let them think I was selfish. Let them think I was stupid. Let them think whatever they needed to think to feel superior. While they were busy judging me, I was going to be busy making sure that when this was over, they'd never be able to dismiss me again. The next morning, I went for a run along the waterfront. The air was crisp and cold, the kind of Seattle autumn morning that cleared your head and sharpened your focus. I ran past tourists taking photos of the Space Needle, past coffee shops already filling with the early crowd, past the piers where ferries were loading passengers for the morning commute. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs ached and my mind was clear of everything except forward momentum. When I got back to my apartment, I had 7 missed calls from my mother and a text from my father that simply said, "Call me now." I didn't call. Instead, I showered, made coffee, and opened my laptop. Carolyn had sent over the draft of our letter to the board. It was a masterpiece of legal precision, polite and professional while making it absolutely clear that I was not going to be quietly shuffled aside. It outlined my contributions, referenced the patent situation without explicitly threatening anything, and requested a formal meeting to discuss transition terms. I read it 3 times, made a few minor edits, and sent it back with my approval. "Send it Tuesday morning," I confirmed. First thing. My phone rang. Carolyn. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "We need to meet," she said. "Something's come up." An hour later I was back in her office, and she was sliding a folder across her desk toward me. Inside were printouts of emails, financial documents, and what looked like internal memos from Vertex. "Where did you get these?" I asked. "Let's just say I have sources who are very interested in corporate governance. These are from the last board meeting. The one where they discussed your position." I started reading. The memos were damning. Stephen had presented my removal not as a performance issue but as a cost-saving measure. He'd suggested that my compensation package was too high, that they could bring in someone younger and cheaper to handle the technology division. He'd never mentioned my patents, my contributions, or the fact that I'd built most of their core infrastructure. "He's lying to the board," I said quietly. "Not lying. Omitting. Which is almost worse because it means he knows your value and he's deliberately hiding it to justify removing you cheaply." I kept reading. One board member, Helen Ortega, had asked pointed questions about the technology roadmap and who would lead it after my departure. Stephen had been vague in his responses. Another board member had raised concerns about intellectual property transitions. Stephen had assured them it was all handled. "But it's not handled," Carolyn said. "Because you haven't agreed to anything. And those patents are still jointly owned. He's making promises to the board that he can't keep without your cooperation. So we have him in a bind. We have him in a corner. If we approach Helen Ortega directly, show her these documents, show her that Stephen is misleading the board about your value and about the complications of your departure, she's going to have questions. Big questions. The kind of questions that make boards start wondering if their CEO is the right person to lead the company. This was bigger than I'd thought. This wasn't just about my severance package anymore. This was about Stephen Lockhart's credibility, about board dynamics, about the fundamental direction of the company I'd helped build. "How far are we going with this?" I asked. Carolyn leaned back in her chair, that sharp smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "As far as it takes. You asked me to make sure they paid you what you're worth. Well, what you're worth is whatever it takes to make this problem go away without destroying their CEO's reputation and the company's stability. And based on these documents, based on the position Stephen has put himself in, that number is going to be very, very high." "How high?" She pulled out a legal pad covered in calculations. "Based on your contributions, your patents, the potential damage you could cause to their operations, the cost of litigation if this goes public, and the premium they'll pay to keep you quiet about Stephen's misrepresentations to the board. Conservative estimate, 30 million. Aggressive estimate? Could be upward of 50. I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite excitement, not quite fear. Something else. The realization that this was real, that the number I'd thrown out casually at dinner with my family might actually be achievable. What do we do next? We wait for their response to our letter. Then we set up a meeting with Helen Ortega. Not to threaten, just to have a conversation about the company's technology future and her concerns about leadership direction. We let her draw her own conclusions about what your departure might mean. And if Stephen finds out we're talking to board members? Then he panics. And people make mistakes when they panic. I left Carolyn's office feeling like I was standing on the edge of something vast. This wasn't just about proving my family wrong anymore. This was about reshaping the entire narrative of my departure, about turning what was supposed to be a quiet removal into something that would define how Vertex operated for years to come. My phone had been buzzing throughout the meeting. I finally looked at it when I got back to my car. 12 missed calls. 8 from my mother, 4 from Brandon. And 1 voicemail from my father. I played it on speaker. Natalie, his voice was controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but you need to stop this immediately. I've spent 40 years building relationships in this city, building a reputation for this family. What you're doing, threatening your employer, causing scenes at family dinners, it reflects on all of us. Call me back. Today. I deleted the voicemail without responding. They still didn't understand. This wasn't about them. This wasn't about family reputation or social standing. This was about me, finally, after all these years, deciding that my worth wasn't determined by their approval or their understanding. It was determined by what I'd built, what I knew, and what I was willing to fight for. And I was willing to fight for all of it. Tuesday morning came with fog rolling in from the Sound, the kind of thick gray blanket that made downtown Seattle feel like it was floating in another dimension. I stood at my apartment window with my second cup of coffee, watching the city slowly materialize through the mist. Somewhere across town, Carolyn was sending our letter to Vertex's board. Somewhere in a corner office on the 42nd floor, Stephen Lockhart was about to have a very bad day. My phone rang at 9:15. Unknown number, but I recognized the area code. I let it go to voicemail. 3 minutes later, another call from a different number. Then another. By 9:30, I had 6 missed calls and my message inbox was lighting up like a Christmas tree. They were panicking already, and we'd barely started. The first voicemail was from Patricia Dunn. Her voice had lost all its HR polish, the careful neutrality replaced with something sharper. Natalie, we need to speak immediately. Please call me back as soon as you get this message. It's urgent. The second was from someone in legal, a man whose name I recognized but had never actually spoken to. Ms. Brennan, this is Thomas Webb from our legal department. We've received some correspondence that requires immediate clarification. We'd like to schedule a meeting today if possible. I didn't call anyone back. Instead, I got dressed carefully, choosing a charcoal suit that I usually saved for board presentations, and drove to a coffee shop in Fremont. It was one of those places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, the kind of spot where tech workers went to pretend they weren't constantly connected to their devices. I ordered an Americano and settled into a corner table with my laptop. Carolyn had copied me on the letter she'd sent. Reading it again, I could appreciate the surgical precision of her language. She never once used the word lawsuit. Never made explicit threats. Just asked questions. Questions about the process for executive transitions. Questions about intellectual property protocols. Questions about how the board planned to address continuity concerns in the technology division. Each question polite, each one carrying an undertone of "we know something you hoped we didn't." The real genius was the final paragraph. It referenced a desire to ensure smooth transition that protects both company interests and individual contributions to the organization's success, with particular attention to preserving the innovative culture that has driven Vertex's market position. It sounded like cooperation. It read like a loaded gun. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Helen Ortega. Carolyn Wade suggested we might have interests to discuss. Are you available for coffee Thursday morning? I stared at that message for a long moment. Helen Ortega reaching out directly, not through official channels, not through Stephen or the company. This was the beginning of exactly what Carolyn had predicted. The board fracturing, questions being raised, people starting to wonder if maybe there was more to my departure than a simple restructuring. "I'd be happy to meet," I typed back. "Pioneer Square? There's a place called Zeitgeist that's quiet in the mornings." Her response came quickly. 10 o'clock works. Looking forward to it. I was putting my phone away when it rang again. This time I recognized the number. My brother Brandon. I almost declined the call, but curiosity got the better of me. "What the hell did you do?" His voice was tight with anger. "Dad got a call this morning from Robert Ashton. Apparently Robert plays golf with someone on Vertex's board and word is spreading that you're threatening to sue the company." "I'm not threatening anything. I'm having conversations about my departure terms." "That's corporate blackmail, Natalie. You're holding your own company hostage over some patent technicality." "It's not a technicality. Those patents represent years of my work, innovations that are fundamental to Vertex's current products. I have every right to ensure I'm fairly compensated for my contributions." He made a sound of disgust. "You know what Dad said this morning? He said you've always been selfish, always put your own ambitions above family. And he's right. You're so focused on proving something that you're willing to embarrass all of us." "Embarrass you?" I felt heat rising in my chest. "Brandon, I've spent 9 years building something meaningful while you've been shuffling money around and calling it success. I've created technology that thousands of companies use every day. I hold patents that are worth millions. And now, when I stand up for myself, when I refuse to be quietly discarded, suddenly I'm the problem? You don't get it. This isn't about your work or your patents or whatever. This is about knowing when to walk away with dignity instead of burning bridges. Maybe I'm tired of walking away. Maybe I'm tired of being the one who has to be dignified while everyone else gets to take what they want." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again his voice was colder. "Dad wants you to know that if you keep going down this path, you're on your own. Family stands together, and what you're doing, threatening your employer, making scenes, it's not how we operate." "Then I guess I'm not part of how we operate." I ended the call before he could respond. My hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear or doubt. From anger, yes, but also from something else. Clarity. For years I'd bent myself into shapes that might earn their approval, might make them see me as an equal. But they never would. Not because I wasn't successful enough or impressive enough. Because I'd chosen a path they didn't understand and couldn't control. To them, I would always be the daughter who'd made the wrong choice, and nothing I achieved would change that fundamental belief. My laptop pinged with an email. "Stephen Lockhart, subject line marked urgent." I opened it, already knowing what I'd find. "Natalie, we need to meet immediately to discuss the letter sent to our board this morning. There seems to be some confusion about your departure terms and the patent situation. I'm certain we can resolve this quickly and amicably if we sit down together. My office, today at 2. I read it twice, analyzing the language. Confusion implied I was mistaken about something. Quickly and amicably meant he wanted to make this go away before it became a bigger problem. His office meant he wanted home field advantage, wanted me walking into his territory, sitting across from him in the space where he held power. I typed back, "I'm available to meet, but I'd prefer neutral ground and I'll be bringing my attorney. How about Thursday afternoon at Carolyn Wade's office? Say 3 o'clock? His response took 15 minutes, long enough that I knew he was consulting with someone, probably legal, definitely panicking. "Thursday works. I'll bring Thomas Webb from our legal team." Game on. I spent the rest of Tuesday and all of Wednesday preparing. Carolyn and I went through every document, every patent filing, every email that demonstrated my value to the company. We built timelines showing when I'd created what, how my innovations had directly led to product launches, how my patents were being used in systems that generated revenue. We calculated not just what I was owed in traditional severance terms, but what my intellectual property was actually worth to Vertex. The numbers were staggering. Conservative estimates put my contributions at generating over $200 million in annual revenue for the company. My 3 jointly owned patents, if I chose to license them to competitors or dispute their use, could tie Vertex up in litigation for years and potentially force them to redesign core infrastructure. This isn't just leverage, Carolyn said Wednesday evening. We were in her office again, papers spread across every surface. This is a nuclear option. If they push back too hard, if they try to lowball you or force you out without proper compensation, you have the ability to seriously damage their business. I don't want to damage them. I built that company. Those are my innovations, my work. I know. But they need to understand that you could. That's the difference between walking away with a standard severance package and walking away with what you actually deserve. Thursday morning I dressed for battle. Black suit, white shirt, minimal jewelry. I looked professional, composed, ready for war in a conference room. I met Helen Ortega at Zeitgeist at exactly 10 o'clock. She was already there, sitting at a corner table with a cappuccino, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant twist. She stood when I approached, extending her hand with a firm grip. Natalie. Thank you for meeting with me. Of course. Though I'll admit I'm curious about what interests we might have to discuss. She smiled, the kind of expression that suggested she was used to playing chess while other people were still learning checkers. Let's not pretend, shall we? I've been on Vertex's board for 4 years. I've watched you transform our technology division from competent to industry-leading. I've read your proposals, sat in on your presentations, watched you handle crises that would have broken lesser executives. So when Steven suggests removing you as a cost-saving measure, I have questions. I sipped my coffee, waiting. One thing I'd learned in 9 years of corporate life was that silence was often more powerful than speech. I received an interesting letter this week, Helen continued. From your attorney. Asking questions about transition processes and intellectual property protocols. And I found myself wondering why those questions needed to be asked at all. Why you weren't in that conversation from the beginning. I wasn't given much choice in the conversation. I was informed my role was being restructured. When I asked about terms, I was told to take a few days to think about my options. And what are your options, Natalie? I met her gaze directly. I could walk away quietly with whatever standard package they offer. Or I could ask questions about why my jointly owned patents are being used in products I'm not being compensated for. I could inquire about whether the board is fully aware of how integrated my innovations are in your core infrastructure. I could wonder aloud whether removing your CTO without proper planning for technology continuity is in the company's best interests. Helen leaned back in her chair, studying me. And which option are you choosing? The one where I'm treated with the respect and compensation I've earned. I'm not interested in destroying what I built. But I'm also not interested in being quietly erased so Steven can bring in someone cheaper who'll be easier to control. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. There's been tension on the board for months. Some of us feel Steven is too focused on rapid expansion, on flashy acquisitions and market presence, at the expense of the technology foundation that made us successful in the first place. Your departure, if it happens the way he's suggesting, sends a very clear message about company priorities. And what message is that? That innovation is expendable. That the people who build things matter less than the people who sell things. That we're becoming just another company chasing quarterly numbers instead of actual advancement. I felt something click into place. This wasn't just about my severance. This was about fundamental disagreement over company direction, and I'd somehow become the focal point of that larger battle. What do you need from me? I asked carefully. Nothing yet. But I wanted you to know that not everyone on the board is aligned with Steven's approach. Some of us think losing you would be a strategic mistake. Some of us are asking harder questions about why this is happening and whether the reasons we're being given are the whole truth. We talked for another 30 minutes. Helen asked about my patents, about the specific innovations I'd led, about my vision for where the technology could go. She wasn't interrogating me. She was building her own understanding, forming her own conclusions about whether my departure was really in the company's best interests. By the time we stood to leave, I understood that the battle lines were being drawn, and I had at least one person in a position of real power who was willing to question the official narrative. That afternoon, I walked into Carolyn's office at 2:45 for my 3 o'clock meeting with Stephen. Carolyn was already there, dressed in a sharp navy suit that somehow made her look even more formidable. She'd arranged the conference room strategically, placing us on one side of the table with our backs to the windows, forcing Stephen and whoever he brought to sit facing the afternoon light. They arrived at 2:58. Stephen Lockhart looking slightly rumpled despite his expensive suit, and Thomas Webb, the company's legal counsel, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I'd seen Thomas around the office but never worked with him directly. He was older, maybe late 50s, with gray hair and the kind of face that gave nothing away. Stephen tried to smile as he sat down. "Natalie. Thanks for meeting. I think there's been some misunderstanding about the situation." "I don't think there's been any misunderstanding," I said calmly. "You informed me my role was being restructured. I sought legal counsel to discuss my options. That seems straightforward." Thomas Webb opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "We've prepared a severance offer that we think is quite generous. 6 months' salary, continuation of benefits for a year, and accelerated vesting on your remaining stock options. In exchange, we'd need you to sign a standard non-compete agreement and IP assignment confirming that all work product during your employment belongs to Vertex." I didn't even look at the papers he slid across the table. Carolyn did, picking them up with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was looking for landmines. "This is insulting," she said after a moment. "Ms. Brennan has 9 years of service, holds the title of Chief Technology Officer, and her contributions to your technology stack are fundamental to your current products. 6 months' salary is what you'd offer a mid-level manager you're letting go for performance issues." "This is a standard executive separation package," Thomas replied. "We're not terminating for cause. This is a mutual separation based on company restructuring." "Mutual implies agreement," Carolyn said. "I don't see Ms. Brennan agreeing to anything yet. Particularly not when the IP assignment you're requesting includes patents that are jointly owned, not fully assigned under her original employment contract." Stephen shifted in his chair. "Those patents were developed while Natalie was employed by Vertex, using company resources." "Partially correct," Carolyn said. 3 of the 5 patents Ms. Brennan holds were filed before her employment contract was updated in 2019 to include full IP assignment clauses. Those 3 patents are joint ownership under the original agreement. Which means Ms. Brennan has equal rights to license, use, or transfer those patents as Vertex does. Thomas Webb's expression didn't change, but I saw Stephen pale slightly. "This is a technicality. The intent was always that work product belonged to the company." "Intent isn't the same as legal reality," Carolyn replied smoothly. "And those 3 patents, let me see," she pulled out her own folder, "patents covering distributed load balancing architecture, automated failover systems, and predictive scaling algorithms, those are all currently in use in your core product offerings, correct?" Stephen looked at Thomas, who gave a small nod. "They're part of our infrastructure," Thomas admitted. "So if Ms. Brennan were to, say, revoke Vertex's license to use those patents, or license them to competitors, what would be the impact on your products?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Those patents weren't peripheral features. They were foundational. Removing them would require rebuilding core systems, a process that would take months and cost millions, not to mention the disruption to clients and the damage to reputation. "We're not looking to be adversarial," Stephen said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "Natalie's been a valued member of our team. We want her to leave on good terms." "Then you need to value her appropriately," Carolyn said. 6 months' salary is not good terms. That's dismissal terms. What we're looking for is recognition of Ms. Brennan's actual contributions, proper compensation for the intellectual property she's created, and assurance that her departure won't be characterized as anything other than a strategic transition." "What are you asking for?" Thomas Webb asked directly. Carolyn glanced at me. I nodded slightly. $15 million cash, I said. Full vesting of all stock options regardless of timeline. Continuation of benefits for 3 years. A glowing reference letter from the CEO and board. And most importantly, a public announcement that frames my departure as a planned transition to pursue other opportunities, with full acknowledgement of my contributions to the company's success. Stephen actually laughed, though it sounded hollow. That's absurd. We don't have budget for that kind of payout. You have a market cap of $8.2 billion, Carolyn said. You absolutely have budget. The question is whether you prefer to spend $15 million now for a clean separation, or spend significantly more on litigation, product redesign, and reputation management if this turns into a public battle over IP rights and executive treatment. This is extortion, Stephen said, looking at Thomas like he expected backup. But Thomas was studying the papers Carolyn had provided, and his expression was troubled. These patents are legitimate joint ownership, he said slowly. If Ms. Brennan chose to dispute their use or license them elsewhere, we'd be looking at significant operational disruption. The legal costs alone would be substantial, not to mention the time and attention it would require from leadership. So you're holding the company hostage, Stephen said to me directly. Everything you built, you're willing to destroy it because you're not getting your way. I met his eyes without flinching. I'm not destroying anything. I'm asking to be compensated fairly for what I created. You're the one who decided to restructure me out. You're the one who went to the board and characterized my departure as cost-saving instead of acknowledging the actual complications. You're the one who offered me 6 months' salary for 9 years of building your company's foundation. His jaw tightened. I need to discuss this with the board. By all means, Carolyn said pleasantly. We're happy to give you time to consider. Ms. Brennan and I are available to meet again early next week. Shall we say Monday morning? After they left, Carolyn and I sat in silence for a moment. Then she grinned. That went better than I expected. Did you see Webb's face when I mentioned the patents? He knew immediately that they're in trouble. Stephen's going to fight this, I said. He's not going to go to the board and admit he miscalculated. He doesn't have to admit anything. He just has to solve the problem. And right now, you're a very expensive problem. The question is whether it's cheaper to pay you $15 million or risk everything that comes with a prolonged fight. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. Your father wants you to know that Robert Ashton's golf partner sits on Vertex's board. Whatever you're doing, you need to stop before you destroy your reputation completely. I showed the text to Carolyn. She read it and shook her head. They still don't understand, do they? This isn't about reputation. This is about worth. They've never understood, I said quietly. And they never will. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine, looking out at the city lights flickering in the darkness. My phone had been buzzing all day with calls from my family that I hadn't answered. Somewhere across town, Stephen Lockhart was probably in an emergency meeting with Thomas Webb, trying to figure out how to make me disappear without paying what I was asking. Somewhere in a tasteful home in Medina, my father was probably ranting about my selfishness while my mother worried about what her friends would think. But I wasn't thinking about any of them. I was thinking about 9 years of work, of late nights and impossible deadlines, of innovations that had seemed crazy until they worked, of building something from nothing and watching it grow into something that mattered. I was thinking about every time I'd been dismissed, every time I'd been underestimated, every time someone had assumed I didn't know my own worth. I pulled out my laptop and opened a document. Started writing down everything I wanted to say, everything I'd held back for years. Not for them. For me. A record of what I'd actually done, who I'd actually been, separate from anyone else's narrative about me. Tomorrow I'd keep fighting. Next week I'd sit across from Stephen again and refuse to back down. Eventually, one way or another, this would end. But tonight, I was simply acknowledging a truth I'd been avoiding for too long. I'd spent my entire life trying to earn respect from people who were never going to give it. And that wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of their limitations, their inability to see beyond their own narrow definitions of success and value. The city stretched out below me, lights and shadows, possibility and risk. I raised my glass to the window, to my own reflection looking back at me. Here's to knowing what you're worth, I whispered. And refusing to accept anything less. The weekend passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. I ignored 17 calls from various family members, deleted 12 voicemails without listening to them, and spent most of Saturday in my apartment working with Carolyn on contingency plans. We mapped out every possible response Vertex might have, every counteroffer they might make, every way they might try to squeeze me into accepting less than what I was demanding. Sunday afternoon, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered not answering. But curiosity won out. I looked through the peephole and saw my brother Brandon standing in the hallway, hands shoved in the pockets of his expensive jacket, looking uncomfortable in a way I'd rarely seen. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "What do you want, Brandon?" He glanced past me into my apartment, then met my eyes. "Can I come in? I promise I'm not here to lecture you." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. He walked in slowly, taking in my space like he was seeing it for the first time, even though he'd been here before. The difference was that before, he'd barely looked around, too busy talking about himself to notice anything about my life. "Nice place," he said, and it almost sounded genuine. "You didn't come here to compliment my apartment. What do you want?" He sat down on my couch without asking, then seemed to realize what he'd done and looked at me for permission. I nodded, staying standing. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from when we were kids, and he was about to admit something he didn't want to say. "Dad sent me." He paused, then corrected himself. "Actually, that's not true. I told Dad I was coming, but he didn't send me. I wanted to talk to you." "So talk." He was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands. "I had lunch with Robert Ashton yesterday. He mentioned that Vertex's board is in chaos. Apparently there are questions being raised about leadership, about how they handle executive transitions, about whether the CEO has been transparent with the board about operational dependencies." I waited, not giving him anything. "Robert said his golf partner, the one who sits on your board, is seriously concerned. He thinks Stephen Lockhart might have misrepresented the situation with your departure, that there are complications nobody understood until your lawyer started asking questions." "That's interesting," I said neutrally. Brandon looked up at me. "Nat, what are you actually doing? And don't give me the corporate speak. I'm not Dad. I don't care about family reputation or what people think. I want to know what's really happening." It was the first time in years he'd asked me a question like he actually wanted to hear the answer. I moved to the window, looking out at the city rather than at him. They wanted to remove me quietly. Restructuring, they called it. Offered me 6 months severance for 9 years of work, for patents that generate hundreds of millions in revenue, for building their entire technology foundation from scratch. They wanted me gone on the cheap, and they wanted me silent about it. "So you're fighting back?" "I'm demanding what I'm worth." "There's a difference." He was quiet for a long moment. "How much are you asking for?" $15 million. Plus full stock vesting, extended benefits, and public acknowledgement of my contributions. He let out a low whistle. "That's a lot of money. It's a fraction of what I've generated for them. And it's less than what a legal battle would cost them, less than the operational disruption if I disputed my patent rights, less than the reputation damage if this became public." "And you'd really do that? Blow up your own company?" I turned to face him. "It's not my company, Brandon. That's the point. I helped build it, I created fundamental pieces of it, but they've made it very clear that I'm expendable. So yes, if they try to discard me without proper compensation, I'll use every piece of leverage I have." He nodded slowly, processing. "Dad thinks you're being vindictive. Mom thinks you're having some kind of breakdown. They wanted me to come here and talk sense into you. And what do you think?" "I think," he said carefully, "that I've spent my entire life watching you be better than me at everything that actually matters, and nobody in our family ever noticed. You built something real, Nat. You created technology that changed how businesses operate. I just move money around and pretend it's important. The admission hung in the air between us. I'd never heard him say anything like it before. So why are you really here? Because I don't want to be the person who sides with them when they're wrong. I've done that my whole life, gone along with Dad's opinions, backed up their version of reality. And I'm tired of it. You're my sister. I should have stood up for you years ago. I felt something shift, not quite forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of understanding. You're still going to Sunday dinners at Dad's house. You're still going to nod along when he talks about traditional values and proper behavior. Probably, he admitted. But I wanted you to know that just because I'm not fighting your battles doesn't mean I think you're wrong for fighting them. After he left, I sat on my couch for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Brandon had never been my ally. He'd been the golden child, the favored one, the son who did everything right. But maybe, just maybe, he was starting to see the cost of that position, the way it required him to diminish everyone else to maintain his place. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and sharp autumn air. I dressed in my armor again, another suit, another mask of professional composure. Carolyn and I met at her office an hour before our scheduled meeting with Vertex's legal team to go over our strategy one more time. They're going to try to split the difference, she predicted. Offer you something between their 6 months and your 15 million. 8 million, maybe 10. They'll frame it as generous, as more than fair, and they'll put pressure on you to accept it rather than drag this out. And if I say no? Then we escalate. We start making noise with other board members. We hint to the press that there are interesting questions about executive treatment at Vertex. We make it clear that this isn't going away quietly. At 10 o'clock, Stephen Lockhart walked into Carolyn's conference room with Thomas Webb and someone new. A woman I recognized from board meetings, though I'd never spoken with her directly. Margaret Hastings, one of the board's longer-serving members, known for being pragmatic and numbers-focused. Natalie, Margaret said, extending her hand. Thank you for agreeing to meet again. I wanted to be part of this conversation to ensure we're finding a solution that works for everyone. I shook her hand, noting the careful phrasing. A solution that works for everyone. Not a solution that's fair to me, but one that balanced all interests. This was going to be an exercise in corporate diplomacy, where my actual worth would be negotiated down to what was convenient for them. We spent the first 20 minutes on preliminaries, everyone being excessively polite, dancing around the real issues. Then Margaret got down to business. We've reviewed Ms. Brennan's contributions to Vertex, and we recognize that her departure requires more than standard severance. We've prepared a revised offer that we believe appropriately values her service. Thomas slid a folder across the table. I didn't touch it. Carolyn picked it up, her expression neutral as she read through the pages. 10 million, she said after a moment. Plus full vesting and 2 years of benefits. In exchange for complete IP assignment, including the jointly owned patents, non-compete lasting 18 months, and an NDA covering all aspects of employment and departure. She looked at me. I looked at Margaret Hastings. That's your final offer? Margaret nodded. We believe it's extremely generous. It's significantly above standard executive separation packages, and it reflects our appreciation for Natalie's contributions. It's also significantly below what Ms. Brennan is requesting, Carolyn said. And the terms you're asking for, complete IP assignment and an 18-month non-compete, those are worth additional compensation on their own. We're prepared to move quickly on this offer, Stephen said. Sign today, and we can have funds transferred by end of week. Clean break, positive references, everyone moves forward. That's when I understood their strategy. They were betting that 10 million in hand would be too tempting to pass up, that I'd take the sure thing rather than risk a prolonged fight for the additional 5 million I was asking. They were counting on me being reasonable, being practical, being the good corporate citizen who knew when to compromise. I pulled out my phone and opened my email. Found the message I'd prepared over the weekend, the one I'd hoped I wouldn't have to use. Attached to it was a document Carolyn and I had created, a detailed analysis of my contributions to Vertex, including revenue generated by my innovations, market value of the patents, and a timeline of my leadership during critical company moments. I forwarded that email to 3 addresses. Helen Ortega. 2 other board members I knew had concerns about company direction. And Keisha Reynolds, the tech journalist whose business column was read by every decision-maker in Seattle's business community. "What are you doing?" Stephen asked, his voice tight. "I'm declining your offer," I said calmly. "And I'm making sure that everyone who needs to understand the full picture has access to the information they need to make informed decisions." Margaret Hastings's expression hardened. "That's confidential company information. It's a summary of my work, which I have every right to share. It doesn't contain trade secrets or proprietary data. It's simply a factual account of my contributions and the value they've generated." Thomas Webb was already on his phone, probably calling someone in IT to see if the emails could be intercepted. Carolyn was watching me with an expression that might have been approval or might have been concern that I just escalated beyond what we'd planned. "You're making a serious mistake," Stephen said. "The board isn't going to respond well to being pressured like this." "I'm not pressuring anyone. I'm providing information. The board should have had this information from the beginning, when you first proposed restructuring my position. The fact that they're just learning about these complications now, that's on you, not me." His face flushed red. "We offered you a fair deal. More than fair. And you're responding by trying to create chaos." I leaned forward slightly. "Stephen, you offered me 6 months' salary for 9 years of work. When I asked for what I'm actually worth, you acted like I was being unreasonable. So here's what's going to happen next. The board members I just emailed are going to read that document. They're going to have questions about why they weren't informed about the patent situation, about the operational dependencies, about the real cost of my departure. And then they're going to ask you why you characterized this as a simple cost-saving restructure instead of what it actually is." "What is it actually?" Margaret asked quietly. "An attempt to remove someone who knows too much and costs too much, without paying for the inconvenience of either." The meeting dissolved after that. Stephen and Thomas left looking like they'd just walked into an ambush. Margaret Hastings stayed for a moment, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're taking a significant risk," she said. "You might win. You might get your $15 million. But you'll also be known as the executive who held her company hostage. That reputation will follow you." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I'll be known as someone who refused to be undervalued, and other executives will learn from that. Either way, I'm done pretending that being reasonable means accepting less than I've earned." After they left, Carolyn closed her notebook and looked at me. "Well, you just lit the fuse. Question is whether we're far enough away when it explodes." My phone started buzzing almost immediately. The first call was from Helen Ortega. I answered. "I received your email," she said without preamble. "Very comprehensive. I'm scheduling an emergency board session for Wednesday. Stephen is going to have to answer some difficult questions about how this situation was presented to us initially. I appreciate you taking the time to review it. Natalie, I want to be clear about something. What you're doing, it's risky. But it's also necessary. This board has gotten comfortable making decisions without full information, and Stephen has gotten comfortable controlling the narrative. Someone needed to force actual transparency. I just wish it hadn't required you putting your entire career on the line." After we hung up, I had 3 more calls. One from Brandon, surprisingly, asking if I was okay and whether I needed anything. One from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be another board member wanting to schedule a call. And one from my mother that I sent to voicemail. Carolyn ordered lunch to be delivered to her office, and we spent the afternoon preparing for every possible response. The board could side with Stephen, decide I was being unreasonable, and stick with the $10 million offer. They could split the difference and come back with something in between. Or, and this was the outcome Carolyn thought was most likely, they could decide that Stephen had mishandled the situation so badly that it was easier to give me what I wanted than to deal with the ongoing complications of refusing. By Tuesday afternoon, I still hadn't heard anything official from Vertex. But the Seattle tech community was starting to buzz. Keisha Reynolds had written a carefully worded column about executive transitions and the importance of properly valuing technical leadership. She hadn't mentioned me or Vertex by name, but anyone in the industry could read between the lines. 3 other tech executives reached out to me privately, asking if I was changing companies and whether I'd consider opportunities with their organizations. It was Marcus Holland who called Tuesday evening with the information that changed everything. Marcus was a former CFO who now consulted for tech companies, someone who had connections throughout the industry and a talent for knowing where the pressure points were. Natalie, I don't know if you've heard yet, but Stephen Lockhart just hired external crisis management consultants. The kind you bring in when you're expecting serious reputation damage. I sat down slowly. How serious? The board meeting Wednesday isn't just about your departure anymore. There are questions being raised about other decisions Stephen's made, other situations where he might have been less than transparent. Your situation opened a door, and now people are looking at what else might be behind it. What are you hearing? There's a technology acquisition from last year, one Stephen pushed hard for. Turns out the due diligence wasn't as thorough as the board was told. Some of the technology they acquired doesn't work as advertised, and there are integration problems that are going to cost significantly more to fix than projected. The board is asking why they're just learning this now. I felt a strange mixture of vindication and something else. I hadn't set out to undermine Stephen's entire leadership. I just wanted to be fairly compensated for my work. But by forcing transparency in one area, I'd apparently exposed weaknesses in others. What does this mean for my situation? It means the board is reevaluating whether Stephen is the right person to lead the company forward. And if they decide he's not, they're going to want to clean house quickly and quietly. Part of that cleanup will be making sure you're taken care of properly so you don't become another example of poor leadership decisions. Wednesday morning, I wore red. A power suit in deep crimson that made me feel like I was heading into battle wearing war paint. Carolyn met me at a coffee shop near her office before the board meeting I wasn't invited to but knew was happening. Your phone is going to explode today, she predicted. Whatever happens in that board meeting, there are going to be consequences that ripple outward fast. She was right. By noon, my phone had 17 missed calls. By 2 o'clock, I had messages from 4 different board members, 3 journalists, and someone from Vertex's communications department. The message from Helen Ortega was simple: call me when you can. Private number. I stepped outside onto the street, finding a quiet corner away from the lunch crowd, and dialed. She answered immediately. The board has accepted your terms. $15 million, full vesting, 3 years benefits, glowing references. Thomas Webb is drawing up the paperwork now. You'll need to come in tomorrow to sign. I leaned against the brick wall of the building, feeling something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. What about Stephen? Stephen Lockhart has agreed to step down as CEO. He'll stay on in an advisory capacity through the end of the quarter to ensure smooth transition, but the board will be conducting a search for new leadership. This isn't being framed as related to your departure, but obviously the timing is connected. And my role? Am I expected to stay during the transition? No. The narrative we're building is that you're departing to pursue other opportunities, with deep appreciation for your contributions and best wishes for your future success. The timing is characterized as mutual and positive. You're free to leave immediately once papers are signed. I thanked her and ended the call. Stood there on the street corner in downtown Seattle, watching people hurry past with their coffee cups and their briefcases, all of them caught up in their own dramas and victories and defeats. I'd won. The number I'd asked for, the terms I'd demanded, all of it. I'd stood up to a company that wanted me gone on the cheap, to a family that thought I was being unreasonable, to an entire system that assumed I'd accept what I was offered because fighting back was too risky. But standing there in the afternoon light, I realized the victory felt different than I'd expected. Not hollow, exactly, but complex. I'd gotten what I wanted. I'd proven my worth in the most concrete terms possible. But I'd also burned bridges, damaged relationships, and earned a reputation as someone who didn't play by the usual rules. My phone rang again. My father. I stared at his name on the screen for a long moment, then answered. I heard you got what you wanted, he said. His voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. I got what I earned. There was a pause. Then, quietly, Robert Ashton's golf partner told him what happened at the board meeting today. Apparently you didn't just negotiate your exit. You triggered a leadership change. I defended my value. What happened after that was the board's decision. Another pause. Your mother wants you to come to dinner Sunday. She thinks we should talk as a family. I looked up at the sky, watching clouds drift past the tops of skyscrapers. About what? About moving forward. About understanding each other better. He cleared his throat. About acknowledging that maybe we haven't always appreciated what you've accomplished. It wasn't an apology. My father didn't apologize. But it was perhaps the closest he'd ever come to admitting he might have been wrong. I'll think about it, I said. And Dad? I won this fight. But I didn't do it to prove anything to you. I did it because I finally understood that my worth isn't determined by whether you see it. It's determined by me, and by what I'm willing to accept. I know, he said quietly. I'm beginning to understand that. After I hung up, I called Carolyn. We need champagne, I told her. Good champagne. I'm buying. That night, in Carolyn's office with a bottle of expensive champagne Marcus Holland had sent over, I looked at the final terms outlined in the preliminary agreement Thomas Webb had emailed. $15 million. Full vesting of stock options worth another $3 million at current valuation. 3 years of benefits. Letters of recommendation from the board. Public statements acknowledging my fundamental contributions to Vertex's success. I'd walked into that first meeting expecting a fight. I'd prepared for war. And I'd won every single thing I'd asked for. But the real victory, I realized, wasn't the money or the terms or even the vindication. It was the moment I decided that I would rather fight and lose than accept less than I was worth. That decision had changed everything, not just the negotiation but how I understood myself. Carolyn raised her glass. To knowing your value and refusing to negotiate it away. I clinked my glass against hers. To burning bridges when they only lead backward. Outside the windows, Seattle sparkled in the darkness, a city of possibilities and second chances and people brave enough to demand what they deserved. Tomorrow I'd sign papers. Next week I'd walk out of Vertex for the last time. Next month I'd figure out what came after. But tonight, I was simply acknowledging a truth I'd been afraid to claim for too long. I was worth fighting for. And I'd finally found the courage to be my own champion. Thursday morning arrived with rain, the kind of steady Seattle drizzle that made the whole city look softer, quieter, like someone had turned down the volume on the world. I stood in front of my closet for a long time, deciding what to wear for the signing. Not armor this time. Not the sharp suits I'd worn to every negotiation and confrontation over the past few weeks. Instead, I pulled out a simple gray dress and black blazer. Professional but not aggressive. Someone moving forward, not someone still fighting. The Vertex building looked different as I approached it. I'd walked through those doors hundreds of times over 9 years, sometimes exhausted from all-nighters, sometimes energized by breakthroughs, sometimes frustrated by politics and bureaucracy. But I'd always walked in as someone who belonged there, whose name was on patents and org charts and the directory in the lobby. Today I was walking in to sign papers that would sever that connection forever. Carolyn met me in the lobby. She'd brought Marcus Holland with her, having insisted that having a witness who understood corporate finance would be valuable. They both looked at me with expressions that mixed pride and concern, like parents watching their kid head off to something important and slightly dangerous. "Ready?" Carolyn asked. "As I'll ever be." The conference room they'd chosen was neutral territory, not Stephen's office or any executive floor, just a standard meeting space on the 15th floor with a view of the Sound. Thomas Webb was already there, along with Patricia Dunn from HR and someone I didn't recognize, a woman in her 40s wearing an expensive suit and carrying herself with the kind of quiet authority that suggested she was important. "Natalie," Thomas said, standing as we entered. "Thank you for coming. This is Jennifer Caldwell, she's from our external legal counsel. She'll be witnessing the signatures today." We all sat down, the table between us covered with neat stacks of paper. Thomas began walking through the documents methodically, explaining each section even though Carolyn and I had already reviewed everything. The separation agreement. The intellectual property transfer, limited only to the 3 jointly owned patents and properly compensated. The non-disclosure agreement, which had been negotiated down to only cover genuinely confidential business information, not the circumstances of my departure. The non-compete, reduced to 6 months and limited to direct competitors in cloud infrastructure. And then the compensation terms. $15 million, to be transferred in 2 installments, half immediately upon signing and half 30 days later. Full vesting of all stock options, approximately 180,000 shares at current market price. Continuation of health benefits for 36 months. Letters of recommendation from the board chairman and from Helen Ortega specifically. There was one additional document, something I hadn't seen in the preliminary agreement. A press release, already drafted, announcing my departure. After 9 years of exceptional service and transformative leadership, Natalie Brennan is departing Vertex Systems to pursue new opportunities. Ms. Brennan's contributions to our technology infrastructure have been fundamental to our success, and we are deeply grateful for her vision and dedication. She leaves with our highest respect and best wishes for her continued success. It was more than boilerplate corporate speak. It was acknowledgement, public and permanent, that I had mattered. That my work had value. That my departure wasn't about failure or inadequacy but about moving forward with dignity intact. I read through every document carefully, even though Carolyn had already reviewed them. This was too important to rush, too significant to leave any detail unchecked. Marcus leaned over at one point, quietly verifying the financial terms, nodding his approval. Carolyn made notes on her legal pad, checking clauses against the agreements we'd negotiated. Finally, there was nothing left to review. Thomas slid a pen across the table. Jennifer Caldwell opened her tablet, ready to witness and record. Patricia Dunn sat with her hands folded, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes carrying something that might have been respect. I picked up the pen. Looked at the signature line on the first document. My hand hovered there for just a moment, and I felt the weight of everything that had led to this point. The dinner where my family had dismissed me. The meeting where Stephen had tried to quietly remove me. The moment I decided to fight instead of accept. Every negotiation, every strategic move, every risk I'd taken that could have backfired spectacularly. And then I signed. My name in black ink, clear and certain. I moved through the stack of documents, signing each one where the little yellow tabs indicated. Carolyn signed as my legal representative. Thomas and Jennifer added their signatures as witnesses. The whole process took maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like closing a chapter that had taken years to write. When it was done, Thomas gathered the documents into folders, handing one set to Carolyn and keeping one set for Vertex's records. Patricia pulled out a final envelope. "Your company laptop, access badge, and corporate credit card," she said. "If you have any personal items in your office, we can arrange a time for you to collect them." I shook my head. "I cleared my office yesterday evening. Everything I needed, I already took." That wasn't entirely true. I'd left things behind, deliberately. Photos with my team, awards and plaques, a whiteboard covered in architectural diagrams that I'd drawn during planning sessions. Let them keep those things. Let them remember that I'd been there, that I'd built something that mattered. I didn't need physical reminders. I carried the important parts with me. There was an awkward moment where everyone stood up and we all realized that this was it. 9 years reduced to handshakes and well wishes. Thomas extended his hand first. "I'm sorry about how this situation evolved," he said quietly. "You deserved better handling throughout the process." It was the closest I'd get to an apology from Vertex, and I appreciated the honesty in it. Patricia hugged me, which surprised both of us. "Take care of yourself," she whispered. "You're going to do amazing things." Walking out of that building for the last time felt surreal. The rain had stopped, leaving everything wet and gleaming in the weak sunlight breaking through the clouds. Carolyn walked beside me, Marcus on my other side, both of them quiet like they understood I needed a moment to process. "How do you feel?" Carolyn finally asked when we reached the street. "Rich," I said, and we all laughed. "But also strange. I spent 9 years building my identity around that company. Now I have to figure out who I am without it." "You're the person who just negotiated a $47 million exit package," Marcus said. "Stock options included. You're the person who stood up to a CEO and a board and refused to be undervalued. That's who you are, with or without Vertex Systems." We went to lunch at a waterfront restaurant, one of those places where you can watch the ferries come and go while eating overpriced seafood. Carolyn ordered wine even though it was barely noon. Marcus regaled us with stories of other executives he'd seen negotiate departures, though he admitted none had been quite as dramatic as mine. We toasted to new beginnings and closed chapters and the beautiful freedom of not having to care what anyone else thought anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. "Dad wants to know if you're coming to dinner Sunday. Mom's apparently cooking your favorite." I stared at that message for a long time. My favorite meal, an olive branch extended through pot roast and mashed potatoes. A week ago, I would have dismissed it as too little, too late. But something had shifted, maybe in me, maybe in them, maybe in the space between us where understanding sometimes grows in the cracks conflict creates. "Tell them I'll be there," I typed back. "But I'm bringing someone." The response came quickly. "Who?" "A friend. Someone who helped me through all this. If they want me there, they get to meet the people who actually supported me." Brandon's reply took longer this time. "Dad's not going to like that." "Dad doesn't have to like it. That's the point." Sunday evening, I pulled up to my parents' house in Medina with Carolyn in the passenger seat. She'd been surprised when I invited her, had questioned whether it was a good idea to bring her lawyer to a family dinner. But I'd been firm. These people needed to understand that I had a life and relationships outside their approval, that I'd built a support system that didn't require their validation. My mother opened the door, her eyes widening slightly when she saw Carolyn beside me. For a moment I thought she might say something cutting, might make one of her pointed observations about appropriate boundaries. But she just smiled, a little strained but genuine enough. "You must be Carolyn. Please, come in." The house smelled like rosemary and roasted meat, exactly as promised. Brandon was already there with Vanessa, both of them looking nervous like they weren't sure what kind of evening this would be. My father stood in the living room, a drink in his hand, his expression carefully controlled. "Natalie," he said. Then, with obvious effort, "Thank you for coming." We all settled in the living room with the kind of forced casualness that comes when people are trying very hard to be normal. Carolyn handled it gracefully, making polite conversation with my mother about the art on the walls, complimenting Vanessa on her necklace, even drawing Brandon into a discussion about market conditions that showed she knew more about his world than he expected. Dinner was called, and we moved to the dining room. The table was set beautifully, my mother's best china and crystal, candles flickering between arrangements of fall flowers. She'd made pot roast exactly the way I'd loved as a kid, with those perfectly crispy potatoes and carrots that had cooked in the juices. It was a peace offering plated and presented with all the care she knew how to give. My father cleared his throat as we all sat down. "Before we eat, I'd like to say something." The table went quiet. My mother's hand paused, reaching for the wine bottle. Brandon looked at me, then at Dad, uncertain. "Natalie," your father continued, his voice measured but carrying something underneath I'd rarely heard from him, "I owe you an acknowledgement. I spent your entire career believing that your choices were mistakes, that the tech industry was too volatile, that traditional paths were safer and better. I was wrong." He paused, seeming to struggle with the next words. "I was wrong about your capabilities, wrong about the value of what you built, and wrong about how I treated your accomplishments. You proved that you understood your worth better than any of us did. And he took a breath, "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, even when that meant standing against all of us." My mother reached over and placed her hand on his, a small gesture of support. I wasn't always supportive either, she added quietly. I cared too much about what other people thought, about maintaining appearances. I should have cared more about understanding what you were actually accomplishing. I felt something tight in my chest start to loosen. This wasn't a full apology, wasn't an admission of all the years of dismissiveness and condescension. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was the beginning of maybe seeing each other as we actually were instead of as the roles we'd been playing. Thank you, I said simply. That means something to me. Brandon raised his wine glass. To my sister, who taught our entire family a lesson in knowing what you're worth and refusing to accept less. We drank to that, and then the conversation shifted to easier topics. Carolyn told stories about other cases she'd handled, carefully avoiding any confidential details but giving everyone a sense of the work she did. My mother talked about a charity project she was actually passionate about, not just doing for appearances. Brandon admitted he'd been considering a career change, something that would feel more meaningful than just chasing bonuses. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still underlying currents of old patterns trying to reassert themselves. But it was different. There was space now for honesty, for complexity, for the possibility that we could be a family that actually knew each other instead of just performing family for each other. After dinner, my father asked if he could speak with me privately. We went to his study, that wood-paneled room where he delivered so many lectures about responsibility and proper behavior over the years. But this time he didn't sit behind his desk in the power position. He sat in one of the chairs by the window and gestured for me to take the other. Robert Ashton told me what happened at the board meeting, he said. Not just about your settlement, but about Stephen Lockhart stepping down. You didn't just negotiate your exit. You exposed leadership failures that the board needed to see. I didn't set out to remove Stephen. I just refused to be quietly discarded. He nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that. About how many times in my career I saw talented people pushed aside because it was convenient, because they asked difficult questions or demanded recognition. I always told myself it was just business, just how things worked. But watching what they tried to do to you, seeing how you fought back, it made me reconsider some choices I made over the years. What kind of choices? He was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the manicured lawn and the water beyond. There was a woman I worked with, 20 years ago. Brilliant strategist, brought in clients, developed new service models. The partners wanted her gone because she was pushing for changes they weren't comfortable with. We bought her out, gave her a severance package that seemed generous at the time. She took it and left quietly. I never questioned whether it was right, whether she deserved more, whether we were making a mistake letting her go. And now? Now I wonder how many other talented people we lost because it was easier to maintain the status quo than to recognize what they brought to the table. How many innovations we missed, how many perspectives we dismissed. He turned to look at me directly. You didn't just negotiate for yourself, Natalie. You set a precedent. Other executives are going to hear about what you did, how you refused to accept less than your worth. That matters. That changes things. The conversation with my father stayed with me through the following weeks as I adjusted to my new reality. I woke up each morning without a commute to plan, without meetings to prepare for, without the constant pressure of deliverables and deadlines. It was disorienting at first, that vast open space of time and possibility. I spent a week doing nothing but reading, catching up on all the books I'd been meaning to get to for years. I went for long runs along the waterfront without checking my watch, without rushing back for calls or obligations. I met friends for coffee in the middle of the day, something I'd rarely had time for when I was grinding through 60-hour weeks. But gradually, the restlessness set in. I'd built my identity around creating things, solving problems, pushing technology forward. Being free was wonderful, but being purposeless was harder than I'd expected. Marcus Holland called 3 weeks after the signing with an interesting proposition. There's a startup in the AI space, he said. Small team, brilliant founder, but they're struggling with infrastructure architecture. They need someone who can build scalable systems from the ground up. I mentioned your name and they're very interested. I'm not looking for another CTO position, I told him. I just spent 9 years building someone else's company. If I'm going to put that kind of energy in again, it needs to be mine. What if it could be yours? What if instead of joining as an employee, you came in as a technical co-founder? Equity position, decision-making authority, building something from scratch instead of inheriting someone else's architecture. The idea sparked something in me. Not another job. Not another situation where I'd pour my knowledge and energy into someone else's vision and hope they valued it appropriately. But a partnership, a chance to build something where I held the cards from the beginning. Send me the details, I said. Let me think about it. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, sketching out ideas. Not for the startup Marcus had mentioned, but for something that had been forming in the back of my mind for weeks. What if I didn't join someone else's company at all? What if I started my own? I'd spent 9 years at Vertex learning not just technical skills but business strategy, fundraising, team building, client relations. I knew how to architect systems, but I also knew how to pitch investors and negotiate contracts and build company culture. And I had something most founders didn't have at the start, enough money to fund the first year or two without outside investment, without giving up control to people who might not understand the vision. The idea took shape slowly over several days. Not another cloud infrastructure company, the market was too saturated. But something related, something I'd seen missing during my years at Vertex. Tools for small and mid-sized tech companies to manage their technical debt, to understand and optimize their architecture decisions, to avoid the kind of scaling problems that could cripple growth. I called Carolyn, ran the idea past her. She listened carefully, asked pointed questions about market size and competitive landscape and intellectual property considerations. Then she said the thing I needed to hear. You have the expertise, the capital, and the network to make this work. The question is whether you want to. Starting a company isn't just about the idea, it's about whether you're willing to do the work when it's hard and uncertain and nobody's validating your choices. I spent that night thinking about her question. Did I want this? Really want it, not just as a reaction to what had happened at Vertex but as a genuine desire to build something new? The answer came somewhere around 3 a.m, when I was staring at my ceiling unable to sleep. Yes. Not because I had something to prove anymore, not because I needed to demonstrate my worth to family or former colleagues or anyone else. But because I'd discovered something important during those weeks of negotiation and conflict. I was good at this. Not just the technical work, but the strategy, the positioning, the willingness to fight for what I believed in. I started making calls. First to technical people I'd worked with at Vertex, talented engineers who'd reached out after my departure asking if I had opportunities. Then to potential advisors, people like Marcus who understood the business side and could help navigate early funding conversations. Then to Keisha Reynolds, the journalist, asking if she'd be interested in covering a new venture when the time came. Brandon surprised me by asking to meet for coffee. We sat in a Capitol Hill cafe on a gray November morning, and he looked nervous in a way I'd rarely seen from my usually confident brother. I've been thinking about what you said, he started. About moving money around versus building something real. And I want to make you an offer. I raised an eyebrow. What kind of offer? Let me invest in whatever you're planning. Not just money, though I have some capital I've been looking to put somewhere meaningful. But also connections, introductions to people who might be helpful. I know you don't need me, but I'd like to be part of what you're building. Why? Because watching you fight for yourself made me realize how much of my life I've spent doing things for the wrong reasons. Chasing status and income without thinking about impact or meaning. You're building something because you believe in it, because you want to solve real problems. I want to be connected to that, even in a small way. I studied his face, looking for signs of the old Brandon, the one who competed with me for parental approval and always made sure he came out ahead. But what I saw was something different. Genuine desire to contribute, to be part of something that mattered beyond quarterly returns and bonus structures. Okay, I said. But if you're in, you're actually in. That means late-night strategy sessions and honest feedback and not pulling rank when we disagree. This isn't a side investment you can brag about at cocktail parties. This is real work. He smiled. I wouldn't want it any other way. By December, I'd assembled a small team. 3 engineers I'd worked with before, all brilliant and hungry to build something new. An operations person who'd reached out through my network. And Brandon, handling initial business development and investor relations, proving himself more capable than I'd expected when he was actually invested in the mission. We worked out of my apartment for the first month, laptop spread across my kitchen table, whiteboards propped against the walls, coffee consumption reaching levels that probably weren't healthy. We argued about architecture decisions and product features and go-to-market strategy. We stayed up late debugging problems and refining pitches and building the foundations of something that felt genuinely exciting. The first investment pitch came in January, a small VC firm that Marcus had connected me with. I walked into their conference room wearing jeans and a blazer, carrying a laptop with our prototype and a deck that explained the problem we were solving. No pretense, no corporate speak, just honest assessment of market need and our approach to filling it. The partner leading the meeting was a woman in her 50s named Rachel Singh, and she listened to my entire presentation without interrupting. Then she asked the question that mattered. Why should we bet on you? You just left your last company in a very public negotiation. Some people might see that as a red flag. I met her eyes directly. Some people might. Or you could see it as evidence that I know my worth, that I'm willing to fight for it, and that I don't accept situations where I'm undervalued or dismissed. Those same characteristics that made me refuse an inadequate severance package are the characteristics that will make me build this company the right way, treating people fairly, valuing contributions appropriately, creating something sustainable instead of just chasing quick exits. She smiled. I like that answer. We're in. The funding came through in February, enough to rent actual office space and hire additional team members and start scaling beyond the scrappy startup phase. We moved into a converted warehouse space in Sodo, the same neighborhood where Vertex had started years ago. There was something fitting about that, coming full circle but on my own terms this time. The day we moved into the office, I stood in the empty space with Brandon, both of us looking at the bare walls and concrete floors and trying to imagine what it would become. This is really happening, he said. You're actually building your own company. We're building our own company, I corrected. You're part of this now. He looked at me, something shifting in his expression. Thank you for letting me be. I know I haven't always been the brother you deserved, but I'm trying to be better. We're all trying to be better. That's kind of the point. March brought the first client, a mid-sized e-commerce company struggling with technical debt that was slowing their growth. We spent 3 weeks analyzing their architecture, identifying inefficiencies, building them a roadmap for improvement. They were thrilled with the results, and suddenly we had a case study, testimonials, proof that our approach worked. April brought press coverage, Keisha Reynolds writing a feature about female founders in Seattle tech, highlighting my journey from CTO to entrepreneur. The article mentioned my exit from Vertex but framed it as a launching point rather than a scandal. By the time it published, enough distance had passed that people read it as an inspiring story instead of controversial drama. May brought my 35th birthday, and my parents threw a small dinner party. Just family and a few close friends, nothing like the elaborate productions they usually staged. My father gave a toast that was short and sincere, talking about watching his daughter build something meaningful and being proud of the woman she'd become. My mother actually cried, which shocked all of us. Afterward, sitting on their back patio watching the sun set over the water, my mother sat down beside me. I've been thinking about what you said, she started. About how we never really saw you. I want to do better with that. I want to actually understand what you're building, why it matters to you, what you're trying to achieve. It's not complicated, Mom. I'm creating tools that help companies make better technology decisions. I'm building a business that values people appropriately and treats them with respect. I'm proving that you can be successful without compromising your integrity or accepting less than you deserve. She nodded slowly. That sounds like something worth doing. It is. And it's something I couldn't have done if everything hadn't fallen apart the way it did. Getting pushed out of Vertex, having to fight for my worth, learning that I was capable of standing up for myself, all of that was necessary. Painful, but necessary. Summer came with growth, more clients, more team members, more validation that we'd identified a real market need. We moved to a larger office space. I hired a woman as our director of engineering who reminded me of myself 10 years earlier, brilliant and hungry and slightly uncertain about whether she belonged in leadership. I made sure she knew, from day one, that she absolutely did. The company started getting acquisition interest by fall, companies wanting to buy what we'd built and integrated into their existing products. Each time, I said no. Not because the offers weren't good, some of them were genuinely impressive. But because I'd learned something important during my last year at Vertex and everything that followed. I didn't need to sell to prove success. I didn't need external validation or quick exits or anyone else's approval. I was building something that mattered to me, that treated people well, that solved real problems. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. One evening in October, almost exactly a year after that dinner at my parents' house where everything had started unraveling, I sat in my office after everyone else had gone home. The space was quiet, just the hum of servers and the distant sound of traffic below. I pulled up my laptop and opened the folder where I'd been keeping notes, reflections on everything that had happened over the past year. A year ago, I'd been CTO of someone else's company, respected but undervalued, successful but constrained by other people's visions and limitations. I'd been fighting for approval from family who would never really see me, from executives who saw me as expendable, from a world that kept telling me to be grateful for whatever I was offered. Now I was CEO of my own company. Not because I'd taken the safe path or accepted what was offered or compromised my worth to fit other people's expectations. But because I'd been willing to fight for what I deserved, to walk away from situations that diminished me, to believe that I was capable of building something better. The money from Vertex sat in investment accounts, growing steadily but no longer the point. The company I was building mattered more than any exit package ever could. The relationships I'd rebuilt with my family, honest and complex and real, meant more than their approval had when I was still trying to earn it. The team I was leading, people who chose to follow me because they believed in the vision not because they had to, that was worth more than any corporate title. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through messages until I found Carolyn's name. "Thank you," I typed. "For everything. For believing I was worth fighting for when I wasn't entirely sure myself." Her response came quickly. "You were always worth it. You just needed to believe it too." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Seattle spreading below me. The same city I'd looked at from Vertex's 42nd floor, but the view felt different now. Not because the city had changed, but because I had. I'd learned what I was worth. I'd learned to fight for it. And I'd learned that the only approval that really mattered was my own. The future stretched ahead, uncertain and full of possibility. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, more people who underestimated me or tried to take advantage or assumed I should accept less. But I knew now, with absolute certainty, that I would never again let anyone else define my value. That power belonged to me, and I was never giving it away again. I turned back to my desk, opened my laptop, and started planning for tomorrow. Because that's what you do when you finally understand your worth. You stop wasting energy proving it to people who will never see it, and you start building the life that reflects it. One decision, one stand, one refusal to accept less at a time. And somewhere in Medina, in a house by the water where family dinners were slowly becoming real instead of performative, my father was probably telling someone the story of his daughter. Not the story of how she embarrassed the family or caused drama or made waves. But the story of how she knew what she was worth and refused to settle for anything less. How she walked away from a company that wanted to erase her contributions and built something better on her own terms. It was a good story. But the best part was that I was still writing it, still building it, still living it. And this time, I was the one holding the pen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.